He had ruled the underworld for 500 years. It only took one hungry little girl to bring him to his knees. There is a kind of silence that only mothers know. Not the peaceful kind, the desperate kind, the kind that settles at the end of a very long day when the refrigerator is empty, when the last few dollars are already spoken for, when the only thing standing between your child and hunger is the quiet hope that no one notices. That was the silence Serafina Evergreen carried with her, everywhere she went, every single day, and on this particular Sunday night, in a city that never truly slept, under lights the color of old roses and dying embers, that silence was about to be broken by the last person she ever expected. Nocturne City had always belonged to the night. Its streets hummed with electric warmth, blood-red neon signs reflected off the bayou. Jazz bled through cracked doorways, and beneath it all, the quiet understanding that not everyone walking these sidewalks was entirely human. The Crimson Lantern Tavern sat at the river's edge like it had always been there. Worn wooden floors, the smell of grilled meat mingling with something sharper, something sweeter, something most people had long since learned not to ask about. It was the kind of place where no one looked too closely. Tonight, tucked into the corner booth by the window, sat a man who preferred it that way. Simple black shirt, dark hair loose past his shoulders. To any passing eye, just a father having dinner with his son. An ordinary Sunday night, nothing more. But the Vampire King had not lived 512 years by being ordinary. He had simply grown very tired of being extraordinary. Beside him, 5-year-old Prince Thorn attacked his burger with the solemn dedication only small children can bring to food. "Dad," cheeks full, eyes serious, "this is the best thing I've ever eaten." Noctis smiled, quietly, briefly, the way a man smiles when he has almost forgotten how. The door opened, the warm air shifted. Serafina Evergreen stepped inside, one hand holding her daughter Leora's, the other gripping the strap of a bag that had seen better years. Her jeans were faded at the knees, her hair pulled back unevenly, not from carelessness, from a day that had asked too much of her. A young waitress moved to greet them. Sarah had already drifted toward the counter, eyes lowered. "Just a glass of tap water, please." The words barely reached the waitress, soft, careful, practiced, the way you practice asking for very little so that the embarrassment of needing more stays hidden inside your chest where no one can see it. Then Leora tugged at her sleeve. "Mom!" Her voice was barely above a breath. "I'm hungry." Sarah didn't flinch. She squeezed her daughter's hand, once, twice, the way mothers do when they are buying themselves one more moment to figure out what comes next. Across the room, Thorn had gone very still. He set down his burger, his small brow furrowed. That particular way children's faces do when they are feeling something they don't yet have words for. "Dad," he tugged Noctis's sleeve, "she's hungry." The Vampire King looked up. One breath, one heartbeat. He looked at a tired young woman trying to disappear into the corner of a diner, and he understood, with the clarity of someone who had studied human suffering for 5 centuries, exactly what he was seeing. A single mom, alone, carrying everything, asking for nothing, hoping no one noticed the weight. Something shifted behind his ribs, quiet, uninvited. Like the first crack in very old ice, he rose from his seat. In a voice low enough that only she could hear, he said, "This isn't charity, it's just 2 kids who should be playing together." Sarah looked up at him, this calm, dark-eyed stranger, offering something she hadn't been offered in a very long time. Simple, quiet dignity. She hesitated. Beside her, Leora had already turned toward the little boy, with the bright eyes and the half-eaten burger, her expression full of that pure, uncomplicated hope that only 5-year-olds still carry so openly. Sarah sat down. She didn't know his name. She didn't know what he was. She didn't know that the man placing a warm plate of food in front of her daughter had once commanded armies of shadow. She didn't know that in the moment Leora reached for her fork, a thread of invisible darkness had quietly curled around the leg of the table to steady it when it wobbled, so that nothing would spill, so that nothing would embarrass, so that this one small dinner would go perfectly for a child who deserved one perfect thing. She only knew that for the first time in 3 years, someone had looked at her, really looked, and chosen kindness. She had no idea that everything was about to change. A king with 500 years of power and one tired mother changed him in 5 minutes. Do you believe someone can truly change because of love? Drop a 1 in the comments if yes, or a 2 if you think people never really change. We'll see which side wins. And stay with us, because the most unbelievable part hasn't even begun. It started the way most important things do, without anyone intending it to. The second Sunday, Thorn asked to go back. The third, Leora looked for them at the door before they even arrived. By the 4th week, the crimson lantern booth by the window had quietly become theirs. Not through ownership, through belonging. Sarah told herself it was practical. The grove was safe, the food was warm. Leora laughed more on Sunday evenings than she did the rest of the week combined. That was reason enough. She did not examine it more closely than that. She had learned a long time ago that examining good things too carefully was how you lost them. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the vampire king was telling himself something remarkably similar. He came because Thorn asked. He stayed because the alternative was another silent dinner in a palace full of people who feared him. And he was, after 500 years, deeply tired of being feared. That was all. He was a king. He did not need warmth. He did not need the particular sound of a child's laugh carrying across a sun-dappled clearing, or the sight of a young woman wiping her daughter's face with a corner of her sleeve and rolling her eyes when Leora squirmed away. He noticed all of it anyway. It was a Thursday, not a Sunday, when Sarah found the bag outside her apartment door. No note, just a paper sack, carefully folded at the top, a week's worth of food inside, 2 small sets of children's clothes folded neatly with Leora's size on top. She stood in the hallway for a long moment, the bag in her hands, the fluorescent light above her flickering the way it always did. He said he bought too much, his exact words, casual, unhurried. The previous Sunday, at the park's edge, when he'd pressed a similar bag into her hands. These things spoil quickly. It's wasteful to let them sit. She had almost refused. The refusal had risen in her chest the way it always did, automatic, protective. The armor she'd spent 3 years building piece by piece after Leora's father left, after the savings ran out, after the world turned out to be considerably less kind than she'd been raised to believe it would be. But Leora had already reached into the bag with both hands, and Noctis had already turned away. Deliberately, she realized now, so that she wouldn't have to feel the weight of being seen receiving. He gave me the dignity of a turned back, she thought. Who does that? That night, after Leora was asleep in the clean new pajamas that fit her perfectly, Sarah sat alone at the kitchen table and cried. Not from sadness, from something older, more complicated. The kind of crying that happens when you have been strong for so long that one unexpected act of quiet kindness cracks something open. something you didn't even know was sealed. For the first time in 3 years, she whispered to the empty kitchen, "My daughter ate a full meal and wore clean clothes." She pressed her hand over her mouth, made herself stop. The following Sunday, Sarah arrived at Eternal Moon Grove to find Noctis standing beside a small camp stove. The expression on his face was that of a man who had conquered empires and was now being defeated by a saucepan. "It keeps sticking," he said, without looking up. Sarah set down her bag. She took the spoon from his hand. "You're stirring too fast, and the heat's too high. Children's food needs patience." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have never required patience for anything." "No," she said, "I can tell." Something flickered across his face, the startled expression of someone who has not been spoken to plainly in a very long time, and finds, against all expectation, that they don't mind it. She showed him how to stir, slow, circular, steady, how to test the warmth against the inside of his wrist, how to know by the smell alone when it was ready. "It's not about power," she said quietly, watching the steam rise. "Sometimes all a child needs is a warm meal to smile." Noctis looked at her then, really looked, the way he rarely permitted himself, and said nothing. Across the clearing, Thorn handed Leora the last of his bat-shaped popsicle without being asked. Leora accepted it with both hands, solemn as a ceremony. "Brother," she said, experimentally. Thorn's face split open with pure, unguarded joy. "Sister," he agreed. Sarah turned away quickly. Noctis, looking in the same direction, saw her shoulders tremble once before she steadied them. He understood then what it meant to grieve the family your child deserved, and could not have alone. The warmth behind his ribs deepened into something that made him profoundly uneasy. "Stop," he told himself. "You are a king. This is not yours to feel." But the porridge was perfect, and Leora smiled exactly the way Sarah had promised she would. 3 weeks later, the sky over Nocturne City cracked open without warning. Noctis had driven them home many times by now, always in the manner of someone who simply happened to be going the same direction. Tonight the rain came down in sheets, the car filled with the particular intimacy that storms force upon people who are still pretending to be strangers. Leora fell asleep against Thorn's shoulder in the back seat. Sarah watched the rain. Then, slowly, terribly, Noctis felt it. The scent, warm and golden, ancient and rare, rising in the closed space, like something the universe itself had breathed into the world only once. Leora's scent, not human, not quite. Dawn, Thorn had called it, that first night, like the dawn you told me about. Noctis's hands tightened on the wheel. The red crept into the edges of his vision. 500 years of iron discipline. And this child's warmth was undoing it in the span of 3 breaths. Then a small hand touched his. "Sir," Leora's sleepy voice came from the back seat. She had woken without sound, reached forward, rested her tiny fingers on his knuckles. "You're so cold." The red vanished, the hunger dissolved, as though it had never been. "She saved me," he thought. "A 5-year-old child. She saved me." Beside him, Sarah had not moved, but her breathing had changed, quieter, more careful. The way breathing changes when someone is pretending not to feel something they are very much feeling. He said nothing, she said nothing, the rain fell, the city glowed, the children slept. For the length of that drive, the Vampire King felt, improbably and without permission, entirely at peace. He noticed it first on a Tuesday. Leora moving too slowly across the park, her laughter a half-beat late, as though joy was reaching her from somewhere further away than it used to. Her skin in the moonlight filtering through the grove's canopy, carrying the faintest violet undertone that had not been there a month ago. Sarah had noticed too. He could see it in the tight, controlled worry behind her eyes, the way she watched her daughter just a fraction longer than necessary, then looked away, then looked back. She thinks it's exhaustion, Noctis realized. She thinks if she can just feed her enough, rest her enough, love her enough. He examined Leora carefully over the following days, quietly, at a distance, using skills 5 centuries old. What he found turned his blood to ice, the blood decay curse, ancient, rare, triggered by proximity to the vampire world, and to something in Leora's own blood that he was only beginning to understand. The eternal dawn essence, he thought. It's her. It's been her all along. The thing the underworld had hunted for 500 years was sleeping in the veins of a 5-year-old girl who shared popsicles and called his son her brother. There was one cure. He had known it for centuries, recorded in texts so old they had no author, sealed in vaults beneath the palace where no one was meant to look. Royal vampire blood, freely given, not taken, not commanded. Given with full knowledge of what the giving cost. His power, his immortality, 500 years of accumulated strength, released in a single act of will. He had read it once, filed it away, never thought of it again. He thought of it now, alone in the dark, for a very long time. Then, quietly, and without telling anyone, he purchased the Shadow Citadel, the largest employer in Nocturne City's human quarter, and arranged for Seraphina Evergreen to be promoted to head of the cleaning staff, full benefits, effective immediately. He told himself it was a practical measure, a way to keep them close, a precaution. He did not examine it more closely than that. He had learned a long time ago that examining the things you were beginning to love was how you lost them. Then the night came when a rogue vampire named Malachi stepped out of the dark, and everything Noctis had been quietly building began to fracture at the edges. Sometimes the kindest hearts are the ones carrying the heaviest secrets. If this story is staying with you, share it with someone who needs to believe in goodness today. The Shadow Citadel was the kind of building that made people feel small on purpose. 70 floors of black glass and cold light, rising from the center of Nocturne City's human quarter, its lobby floors polished to a mirror shine, its corridors carrying the temperature of quiet authority. The kind of place where important things were decided by people who never raised their voices, because they had never needed to. Sarah had been grateful for the job. She hadn't questioned it. A posting she'd nearly missed. A supervisor who said she'd been specifically requested for the promotion without explaining by whom. She told herself she'd earned it. She had worked hard enough to believe that. She arrived at 5 each morning, before the executives, before the board. She moved through the upper floors in the particular invisibility of people who clean what others dirty, present, silent, unseen. She had learned to prefer it that way. Don't be noticed. Don't ask for more than you need. Keep your head down. Keep Leora safe. That's enough. She was polishing the main chamber's conference table when the elevator opened. She didn't look up at first. Footsteps at this hour usually meant security rounds. Unhurried, indifferent. Already past her before she registered them. These footsteps stopped. The table doesn't need to be polished twice. She knew the voice before she understood how she knew it. Low, precise. The kind of voice that fills a room without rising in volume. Sarah looked up. He stood in the entrance of the main chamber wearing a dark jacket, his hair loose, those quiet eyes watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Behind him, through the open doors, the board was filing in. advisors in black, carrying the cold energy of people who held power not as responsibility, but as appetite. And at the head of the table, the chair the entire room had been arranged around, Noctis moved to stand. "I am King Noctis Valeth. This building belongs to me." The polishing cloth slipped from Sarah's hands. "No," the word formed clearly, the way your mind produces single syllables when the larger truth is too vast to process at once. "No, that's not. He isn't. We sat at a diner table, and he learned to make the porridge. And his son called my daughter sister, and he turned away, so I wouldn't feel ashamed accepting help. He bought this building. He gave her this job. Every Sunday, every bag left at her door, the clothes in Leora's exact size, the promotion she had worked so hard to believe she'd earned on her own, all of it arranged, orchestrated, by the one man in Nocturne City with enough power to rearrange the world around her without her ever feeling the hands that moved it. He pitied me, she thought. The thought landed like a blade. The Vampire King saw a single mom who couldn't feed her child, and pitied me. She collected Leora from the children's waiting room on the second floor without stopping for her things. The hallway, the elevator, the lobby floor she had polished to a mirror shine, the cold air swallowing her the moment the doors opened. She didn't run. Running attracted attention, and she had spent 3 years being very careful not to attract attention. But she walked fast, one hand around Leora's, the other pressed flat against her sternum the way you press on a wound. The apartment was quiet when she arrived. Leora, sensing something wrong the way small children do, through the grip of a hand, through the quality of a mother's silence, sat on the sofa without being asked and did not speak. Sarah stood in the center of the kitchen. The refrigerator was full. It was always full now. She looked at it the way you look at something that has just revealed itself to be something else entirely. On the counter, a small wooden spoon she'd borrowed from him at the Grove and never returned. On the hook by the door, Leora's bright yellow jacket, bought without discussion, hung there so naturally she'd stopped seeing it weeks ago. She saw it now. Every single thing in this apartment that doesn't belong to us came from him. She sat down on the kitchen floor, not dramatically, simply because her legs stopped holding her and the floor was there. I thought he respected me. I thought, for the first time in 3 years, someone looked at me and saw a person. Not a charity case, not a problem to be handled. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. Leora's father looked at us that way, at the end, like something to be managed, and then he left, and I swore I would never let anyone make me feel that way again. The wooden spoon was still on the counter. She didn't throw it away. She didn't know why. What she could not have seen from the floor of her kitchen, inside the clean armor of her wounded pride, was what happened after she left. Noctis dismissed the council, all of them, walked them out with 2 words and 5 centuries of authority behind his voice, then stood alone in the chamber with the cloth still lying where she had dropped it. He did not pick it up. She thinks I pitied her, he realized. The thought arrived with the weight of things that are true and terrible at once. She thinks every kindness was a transaction, that I was managing her the way the council manages things, moving pieces, creating outcomes, never asking permission. He pressed one hand against the cold glass of the window, looking out over the city. I bought this building because I was afraid, he admitted to himself. Not of the council, not of the curse. Afraid that if I didn't create some reason to keep them close, they would leave, the way everything worth keeping eventually leaves. 512 years, and he had never learned how to simply ask someone to stay. Thorn appeared at the chamber door, small and solemn. "Dad, is Leora still our family?" Noctis looked at his son for a long moment. "Yes," his voice was certain, in a way the rest of him was not. "She is." "Then go tell her mom that," Thorn said, with the devastating simplicity of someone who has not yet learned to make things complicated. Noctis said nothing, but something in him shifted, past the cold, past 5 centuries of ruling from a careful distance, toward something far more frightening than power, the willingness to be known. And then, standing alone at the window of a building he had purchased out of fear disguised as protection, he understood what Malachi had truly taken the night he triggered the curse. Not safety, time. The blood decay was accelerating, days, perhaps less, before the choice was made for him. And in that moment, Sarah realized the terrible truth. The man she had fled from was not the danger. The danger was already inside her daughter. Some stories remind us that pride and love speak different languages, and learning to translate takes everything we have. "Stay with us." Leora stopped eating on the second day. Not dramatically, not the way illness announces itself with fever and collapse. She simply pushed her bowl aside at breakfast and said she wasn't hungry. Sarah, who had spent 3 years watching her daughter eat with the focused dedication of a child who understood scarcity, felt the bottom drop out of the world. She has never once not been hungry. By evening, Leora's lips had taken on that faint violet tinge, the one the clinic had attributed to iron deficiency, the one Sarah had been monitoring the way you monitor something you don't want to name, because naming it makes it real. She sat on the edge of Leora's bed long after her daughter fell asleep, watching the slow rise and fall of her breathing. She looks smaller. When did she start looking smaller? The wooden spoon was still on the kitchen counter. She had not moved it. Throwing it away felt like a door closing on something she was not yet ready to close. At midnight, she picked up her phone, set it down, picked it up again. "You are not going to call him," she told herself. "Your daughter is getting worse," another part answered. Quieter, more certain. "And you have known for weeks that he understands what is happening to her in ways no clinic ever will." She set the phone down. She put on her shoes instead. She was 3 blocks from the apartment when the shadow separated from the wall. It moved with intention, unhurried confidence, the bearing of something that had already calculated all available outcomes. Serafina Evergreen. The voice came from the air rather than any mouth. "We have been waiting for you to leave." She turned, she faced it. A man, if the word applied, stood between her and the streetlight. White-haired, elegant, ancient in the way that has nothing to do with age and everything to do with accumulated appetite. Behind him, 2 others materialized from the dark. "Your daughter carries something that does not belong to her," he said pleasantly. "We are only here to take it back." "She is 5 years old." Sarah's voice did not shake. She had spent 3 years making sure of that. "Whatever you want from her, the answer is no." The man smiled. It did not reach his eyes. It did not try. "This isn't a question," he said. And then, from the opposite end of the street, a figure stepped into the light. No armor, no throne, no title, and no shadow. Just a man in a black shirt, standing between a mother and the dark. She said no, Noctis said, Azrael, for that was the white-haired man's name, though Sarah had not yet learned it, regarded the vampire king with the contempt reserved for those who have stopped behaving as their kind should. "You would stand against us for a single mom," he said, "after everything you have built." "I would stand against you," Noctis said, "for her." The simplicity of it hung between them. No rhetoric, no decree. Just the plain, clean fact of it. Azrael studied him for a long moment, then gestured. The shadows withdrew, not in defeat, with the patience of something that has waited 500 years and can afford to wait longer. "This isn't finished," Azrael said. "I know," Noctis said. And then they were gone. The street was empty. The street light buzzed. Somewhere down the bayou, a bird called once and fell silent. Sarah stood on the sidewalk looking at him. This man she had spent months learning to trust and 2 days unlearning. Something in her chest had no immediate name. "You knew they'd come for her," she said. Not an accusation, a statement. "Yes. And the job, the building, all of it. I was afraid." The words came without justification, just the plain weight of a confession. "Not of the council, not of what they would do. I was afraid that if I didn't build something around you, some structure, some reason, you would leave. And I did not know how to ask you to stay without one." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. She thought about 3 years of tap water and empty refrigerators. About a turned back that had offered her the dignity of not being watched while she accepted help. About a wooden spoon she couldn't bring herself to throw away. About her daughter pushing her bowl aside that morning, lips faintly violet, growing smaller. He is terrified, she realized. This man who just stood in the street with nothing but his name. He is more afraid of being left than of anything that walked out of that dark. She understood that fear. She had carried an identical version of it since the day Leora's father didn't come home. "My daughter is getting worse," she said quietly. "I know." "You know what it is?" "Yes." "Then tell me." She stepped forward, not toward comfort, not yet, toward truth. "Not as a king, tell me as family." Something broke open in his face, the way the first light of morning breaks, quiet, inevitable, changing everything without announcing itself. He told her everything, the eternal dawn essence, the blood decay curse, what Malachi had triggered, what the council wanted, what it would cost to stop it, what it would cost him. Sarah listened without moving, with the stillness of a woman who has learned to absorb terrible things and keep standing. When he finished, the street was very quiet. She picked up his hand, cold as it always was. As Leora had noted that first rainy night, she held it between both of hers the way you hold something you have decided to keep. "Then we do it," she said. "Sarah." "She is my daughter," she said, "and she is yours too, whether you've said it aloud or not, so we do it." He looked at her, this woman with the worn jeans. 3 years of quiet, unwitnessed courage running through her like iron. For the first time in 512 years, the Vampire King did not face what was coming alone. For the first time in 3 years, neither did she. For the first time since any of this began, since a hungry little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve in a riverside diner, Sarah knew exactly what she had to do. When love asks us to be brave, it doesn't promise it won't hurt. It only promises we won't face it alone. Share this story with someone who needs that reminder today. The rain came the way it always did in Nocturne City, without warning, without apology, as though the sky had simply decided it was done pretending. Leora was burning, not with fever, with something older, something that had no medical name and no clinical remedy. The violet had spread from her lips to her fingertips. Her breathing had gone shallow in the way that makes a mother count each exhale like it might be the last. Sarah carried her through the rain. She didn't remember deciding to run. Her body had understood before her mind did. The direction, the distance, the destination. Noctis met them at the door. He took one look at Leora and did not speak. There was nothing to say that the situation had not already said more plainly. He brought them inside, laid Leora gently on the sofa, knelt beside her with the focused stillness of a man setting aside everything he was in order to do the one thing that mattered. Thorn appeared at the top of the stairs in his pajamas, came down without being asked, sat beside Leora and took her hand, small fingers laced through smaller fingers, and did not let go. "It's okay, sister," he said quietly. "I've got you." Leora's eyes fluttered open. Something in her breathing steadied. The way breathing steadies when you are no longer entirely alone in what you're facing. Noctis raised his eyes to Sarah. She nodded. He bit into his own wrist, cleanly, without theater, and brought it to Leora's lips. What happened next, Sarah would spend years trying to find words for. The light began in Leora's chest. Not a glow, something more fundamental than that. Like watching a door open onto a room sealed for a very long time. The light inside not new, ancient, pouring out because it finally had somewhere to go. Golden, warm, the color of the first real morning after a very long winter. It spread outward, through Leora's fingertips, through the hand still locked with thorns, into the walls, into the rain-dark air beyond the windows. Leora gasped, a full, deep breath. The violet drained from her skin like water from a glass. Color returned, pink and warm and ordinary, the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever seen. Leora opened her eyes completely, looked up at Noctis with the uncomplicated directness only a 5-year-old still carries. "You're warm now," she said. He looked at his hands. She was right, the coldness that had lived in his blood since the night he was turned. Gone. The power, the throne built on 500 years of shadow. All of it, traded in a single moment for one child's breath. He knelt there for a long time, looking at his warm hands in the golden light, and did not speak. Sarah sat down beside him on the floor, not because she knew what to say, because sitting beside someone when they are reckoning with who they have chosen to become is its own kind of language. After a moment, she leaned her head against his shoulder. He was warm. The rain softened to a murmur. Thorn had fallen asleep, curled beside Leora on the sofa, one arm thrown over her the way children sleep with the things they have decided to protect. Noctis and Sarah sat at the kitchen table. Between them, the wooden spoon. She had tucked it into her bag on the way out the door without thinking. It sat there now like a small, worn monument to something neither of them had a name for yet. He looked at it, then at her. "You kept it," he said. "I couldn't throw it away. I kept trying." A silence settled. The comfortable kind. The rare kind. The kind that only exists between people who have been through something together and come out the other side still sitting at the same table. "I have spent 500 years, Noctis said quietly, believing that power was the only thing that could protect the people I loved, that if I controlled enough, owned enough, arranged enough, nothing could reach them." He looked at his hands again, warm, human, ordinary. "And in the end, the only thing that saved her was the one thing I couldn't arrange, couldn't purchase, couldn't command." Sarah turned the wooden spoon over in her fingers. "Kindness," she said. "Yours," he said. "What you taught me at a camp stove in the park. What Leora does simply by existing. What Thorn learned from watching her." A pause. "I had forgotten that the most powerful things are the ones you can't hold in your fist." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to say you can measure how much someone loves you by what they're willing to become ordinary for." He looked at her. those warm brown eyes that had once held centuries of restrained hunger. Now simply the eyes of a man at a kitchen table at 3 in the morning, figuring out who he was going to be next. "I don't need a king," she said gently. "I never did." "I know," he said. The relief in the way he said it told her he had known for a while. She reached across the table, covered his warm hand with hers. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely. Through the window, the sky above Nocturne City was beginning to lighten at the edges. Pale gray gold, the kind that comes in the last hour before dawn. Not darkness, not full light. Something in between. The house felt different now. Not because everything had been fixed or resolved into a neat answer, because the people inside it had stopped pretending the walls were something they needed to hide behind. The sofa held 2 sleeping children, fingers still laced together. The kitchen table held 2 people learning, slowly and without hurry, what it means to let someone see you all the way through. And between them on the table, 1 small wooden spoon, worn, borrowed, never returned. A family assembled from nothing but kindness. Standing. The most ordinary things, a meal, a spoon, a held hand, are sometimes all it takes to change a life. If this story moved you, pass it on to someone who needs to feel that today. The drawing had been on the refrigerator since October. Crayon on construction paper, the kind of artwork that belongs in no museum and deserves to be in every home. 4 figures of unequal size, rendered in the confident, unself-conscious style of children who have not yet learned to doubt their own vision. Beneath them, in Leora's careful 5-year-old printing, "Our Family." Sarah had taped it up the morning Leora brought it home, pressing the corners flat with both palms. The way you press something you want to stay. She still touched it sometimes on her way to the coffee maker. The grove looked different in full daylight. Sarah had been here 100 Sunday evenings, always in the blue hour, always under amber path lights. She hadn't known until today how the clearing opened in direct sun, how the old oak at the center threw shadows like spread fingers, how the grass held the deep green of something well tended. Noctis walked beside her with his hand shading his eyes. "I had forgotten," he said, squinting gently at the sky, "what sunlight actually feels like." He said it the way a man reads a letter he wrote long ago to a version of himself he barely recognizes. Not grief, not quite wonder, something quieter than both. "Does it hurt?" Sarah asked. "No," he said. Then, after a moment, "It's warm." She smiled. He noticed. Something in his face settled, the way a house settles in the evening, all its tensions released into a comfortable creak. Ahead of them, Thorn and Leora ran between the oak roots with the boundless, purposeless energy of children on a Sunday afternoon who have nowhere to be. Thorn was explaining something about bats. He explained things about bats often. Leora was listening with her whole body, the way she listened to everything. "Brother," Sarah heard her say. "Sister," Thorn answered without breaking stride. That evening, in the kitchen they had quietly come to share, Noctis made the porridge. He did it correctly now, slow stir, low heat, the wooden spoon, the borrowed one, the one that had sat between them at 3 in the morning while the sky turned gray gold, moving in the steady circles Sarah had shown him months ago. At a camp stove in a clearing that smelled of grass and something like the beginning of everything, Leora climbed onto the counter beside him and peered into the pot with great seriousness. "Is it ready?" she asked. He tested the warmth against the inside of his wrist. "Almost," he said. "How do you know?" "You'll know," he said, "by the smell." She leaned forward and breathed in. nose nearly touching the steam. "It smells like Sunday," she decided. He looked at her, this child who had once touched a cold hand in the back seat of a rain-dark car, and, without knowing what she was doing, dissolved 5 centuries of hunger in an instant. "Yes," he said softly, "it does." After dinner, after the children were in bed, Thorne's room across the hall from Leora's, an arrangement that had arrived without negotiation, as though the house itself had decided, Sarah stood at the kitchen window with her coffee. The night outside was mild. Nocturne City glowed at the edges, the bayou lights softer at this distance. She thought about a Sunday evening some months ago, a diner at the river's edge, the waitress who had moved to greet them, a single mom and her daughter quietly redirecting toward the counter instead, a child's voice, "I'm hungry," and a woman who had spent 3 years learning to ask for as little as possible. Someone had looked, not to manage her, not to arrange her, simply to see her, and then to turn away slightly so that accepting what was offered felt less like need and more like belonging. She understood now what that had cost him, what it had taken for the vampire king, a man who had spent 5 centuries holding everything at arm's length, to offer warmth without condition, to learn at last that kindness given freely is not weakness. It is the bravest thing there is. And she understood, too, what Leora had always somehow known, what Thorne had learned from watching her, that you do not need power to change a life. You need only the willingness to share what you have, a meal, a popsicle shaped like a bat, a turned back at the right moment, a hand held in the cold. And she finally understood that the family she had been trying to build alone, working the early shifts, folding laundry after midnight, making the refrigerator look fuller than it was, had not been built from nothing after all. It had been built from kindness, offered and received in both directions, by people who were each, in their own way, trying to find their way back to each other. That was enough. That had always been enough. This story reminds us that the families worth keeping are not always the ones we are born into. They are the ones assembled, slowly and imperfectly, from the small daily acts of choosing each other. It reminds us that kindness offered without condition to someone who has learned to expect very little is not a small thing. And it reminds us that when we sacrifice for those we love, we do not lose ourselves. We find, for the first time, exactly who we are. Perhaps this week, you might do one small thing. Invite someone to the table who has been practicing asking for very little. Pull out the chair, set down the bowl, and turn away slightly, so they can accept it with their dignity intact. It doesn't require power or status or any grand gesture. That is the whole of it. That is, it turns out, everything. If this story felt true to something you have lived, share it with someone you love. Sometimes a story is the quietest way to say, "I see you. You are not invisible. You belong at the table." This vampire tale was born from a real human soul, full of emotion, contradiction, and longing. AI was merely a companion who helped arrange the words to be as beautiful and clear as possible. That's why you'll find it not only terrifying, but also very human.